Hello, I'm happy to walk you through the 10 main differences between Liquity and Maker DAO. Number one being the fact that Maker DAO is based on a human governance system, whereas Liquity is fully algorithmically governed. So what does that mean? With Maker DAO, you have a few parameters like interest rates and collateralization ratio, which are all adjustable through votes. So there is a body that can vote on those changes. And in order to be able to vote, you need to own a token called the Maker token. So that gives you the right to vote. Now, that's an interesting approach, but we think that there are a few problems with it because normally the turnout of those votes is relatively low, so the participation is not very high. And there are also other ways of manipulating the outcome by basically borrowing the Maker just for a second using something called flash loan so that you can basically amplify your voting rights. So we want to avoid all the risks related to voting by making our system fully algorithmically governed. So what that means is that we also have some kind of parameters, like fees that we adjust over time, but we don't do it based on a human interaction or intervention, but the system can automatically measure the inputs from the external world and react accordingly and just adjust those parameters. The second difference I want to point out is collateral. So in both systems, the loans or the borrower's positions, they need to be collateralized. In our case, we only allow Ether as our sole collateral type, whereas Maker has a multi-collateral approach. They have many ERC20 tokens that can be used as collateral. So why do we do this differently? This is kind of a philosophical or political question almost. There are pros and cons for both approaches, but we think that Ether is really the most important, the most trustless, and basically the risk-free token existing on the Ethereum network. And with every other token, there is some added risk. Let's say there is an issuer of a stablecoin, and now you want to accept that stablecoin as collateral for your own stablecoin. Now, what if this issuer fails to give back the value of the token when you request it? And there are similar problems also, just the fact that every other token has its own complexity and potential risks that it may be vulnerable to some security exploits. So that's why we think with Ether we already have the main token that powers the system, and we just want to give people a way of getting loans against Ether. So another key difference is that while Maker and most other DeFi protocols, they have their own front end, so they have a web interface that they run on their own servers, we have a network of decentralized front ends. So this means that everybody can spawn up and run a front end that communicates with our protocol that's running on the Ethereum nodes. One of the key reasons is that we want to make the system really censorship resistant and decentralized, so that even if somebody was to shut down our company or our servers, there would still be somebody around that would keep running the interface. There is also another reason, the fact that with having those multiple decentralized front ends, we can use them as kind of affiliate marketers of our system, as a second level marketing scheme. Because what's also important is that the front ends, they are not just doing it for free, they are incentivized by the protocol, which would pay them out a reward based on the turnover they generate. So it makes sense for them to attract as many users as they can, which also benefits the protocol. So one big difference is that our stablecoin, the LUSD token, is fully and directly redeemable against Ether, while the DAI token is not redeemable against any kind of collateral. So redemption here means that any holder of LUSD has the right to exchange the LUSD tokens for Ether at face value. So face value means that, let's say you own 100 LUSD and you want to exchange them for Ether, then the system would pay out $100 worth of Ether to you. And this mechanism is key to keep the value pegged to the US dollar, because whenever the LUSD price drops below $1, people would have an incentive to redeem. First, an incentive to buy LUSD token on the market for less than $1, then redeem their tokens and sell the Ether they get at a price which basically gives them an arbitrage gain. So this kind of redemption mechanism is not present in Maker. So what that means is that we can create a hard price floor. So a hard price floor means that whenever the price would drop even just slightly below $1, there would be an extremely strong force against it that would push the price back to $1. Because with Maker DAO, you have some stability mechanisms, but I would call them like a soft peg mechanism. So they are like rather indirect. Another big difference is, as Liquity, we are not charging any interest to the borrowers. While on Maker, the loans are subject to what's called a stability fee, which is basically an interest rate. So it's charged regularly over time. But with Liquity, we don't have an interest. We do have a one-off issuance fee. So when you take out a loan, then you may need to pay some percentage of the amount that you draw as a fee to the system, but that's it. So there is no fee that you would have to pay later. And you can keep your position, like keep your debt open as long as you want. So difference number 6 is that our collateralization ratio, the minimum ratio that a borrower needs to maintain, is only 110%, while with Maker, it depends a little bit on the collateral type they have, but for Ether, it's either 130% or 150%. So here, the big question is, how can we achieve that? Because you would think that the lower the minimum collateralization ratio, the riskier the system gets because the less buffer it has to liquidate positions. So this brings us to the key innovation that basically allows us to reduce the minimum collateralization ratio, and which is the way how we do liquidations. Which brings us to difference number 7, liquidation. Maker and other systems in the DeFi space, they usually liquidate loans through an auction mechanism or liquidate debt that becomes under-collateralized in a way where people need to bid to basically bail out this position. We, on the other hand, we have an instantaneous liquidation mechanism. So basically the second where somebody goes underwater, you can liquidate the position just by calling an Ethereum transaction. I think this is the key innovation of our system, which allows us to be more capital efficient. In a nutshell, the way it works is that we have those who would bail out the borrower that is under collateralized, they are already present in our system. So they have already invested in something called the stability pool, so that the tokens that are needed to repay the liquidated debt, they are already available. There's no need to find a buyer or a bidder. An auction takes time because normally you want to have multiple bidders because that leads to a fair price in the end. And just to do that in Maker DAO, that would take 6 hours, their auction. And during the 6 hours time span, the Ether price or whatever collateral price can drop significantly. So you need to have additional buffer just to cover that extra risk of price drops during the liquidation process. While we don't have this because instant liquidation mechanism allows us to cut out that risk. So we first rely on an oracle. We are using Chainlink's Ether USD price. So we first need to get the newest price feed. And this is just done based on the relative price change. So whenever there is a 0.5% or higher change of the Ether price, the Chainlink protocol would then update the price as fast as possible. So as fast as they can get their transactions processed on the Ethereum network. And once that's done, we expect liquidators running their bots who would then pick up the new price and basically call the liquidate function on the borrower that needs to be liquidated. So it's basically more or less the time it takes to process those two transactions on the Ethereum network, which I would say is maybe a few minutes or maybe even less, depending on how congested the network is. So let's get back to our list of 10 key differences between Liquity and Maker DAO. And just as a quick note, so the differences, they get more and more technical as I speak and as I explain them. So let's continue with difference number 8. Maker offers the holders of their DAI token a savings account. They call it a DAI savings rate, while Liquity doesn't have an equivalent way of a saving account, but it has something else which I can explain in a nutshell. But let me just very briefly tell you that this DAI savings rate, this is basically just like a savings account on a bank. So you would lock up your DAI tokens for whatever time period you want, and you would just get an interest rate on that. This interest rate is defined by human governance, and it's currently 0%, but it can go up based on the monetary policy. In our case, it's a little bit different. So we have a stability pool which is used as our primary mechanism or primary line of defense to protect the system whenever there are borrowers that need to be liquidated. The way we do that is by allowing people to deposit LUSD tokens to a stability pool. Of course, people wouldn't do that just for fun. They want something in return. And the main thing that they get in return is a liquidation gain. So when a position, we call them troves, becomes under-collateralized, the system would basically take the amount of LUSD tokens that correspond to the liquidated debt from the stability pool and burn them. It then also cancels the debt, so basically what it means is that it just uses the tokens from the pool to repay the debt, so the tokens are burned. And in return, it gives the collateral that's still held by this position, which should be somewhere around 110%, a bit less maybe, but it should be worth more than the debt, basically, or the value of tokens that were burned. And this collateral of Ether is given to the stability pool depositors. And it's basically given to them pro rata, like in proportion to the deposits they made. So everybody basically loses some portion of their LUSD tokens in that pool, but at the same time gains some collateral from the position, and this should lead to a net gain in the end. So we think that in most cases, given the fact that the Oracle is relatively quick, we could liquidate the loans just slightly below 110%. So it would mean maybe 108 or 9% in most cases. So with every liquidation, there would be like a net gain around maybe 8 or 9%. But of course, this also depends on how many positions become liquidatable. And that's something which is hard to simulate. I mean, it depends on how the Ether price develops in the future. But something I haven't told you yet is that we have another incentive that makes it attractive for people to become stability depositors, and that's a reward they get. So this reward is paid out in LQTY, which is our secondary token, so Liquity, basically. And this token is paid out on a continuous basis based on the amount that you've deposited to the pool. And this starts very high, so it's an early adopter incentive. Over time it would decay, so it fades away, but it really makes it very attractive to become a stability depositor in the first few months, at least, of operation of our system. We just talked about the stability pool and the LQTY token, which is given out as a reward to the pool depositors, which leads me to difference number 9, which is the fact that we are not using the LQTY tokens as a lender of last resort, while Maker DAO is using their Maker token as a means to recapitalize their system if there is a very urgent need for that. So with Maker, they have like their auction mechanism to liquidate the individual positions, like the individual vaults, as they call them. They are liquidated through an auction where basically people pay back, like they pay a price to buy out the collateral from the liquidated position, and the price they pay during this auction is denominated or is paid in DAI, so they can then use this DAI to repay the debt. Now you can imagine that if there is an extreme price drop, like a flash crash, or like just in the auction that takes like 6 hours, it can theoretically happen that, and it happened in March this year, at the Black Thursday, those auctions, they failed. So they were not able to cover the full debt. So somebody could basically bail out the position at a minimum cost of $1 or something. That was an extreme scenario. And in order to save the system from such a situation, they print more Maker tokens and they sell the Maker tokens as well in an auction so that they can then get or suck out enough DAI tokens from the system to rebalance the whole monetary system. So they basically use the Maker token as a lender of last resort to save their system from such losses. Now we don't need that, because in our system, if the stability pool fails because it's just insufficient to cover all the debt that needs to be liquidated, we have a fallback, which is a redistribution, where basically every borrower in the system acts as a co-guarantor of every other borrower. So we basically can redistribute the debt of the liquidated borrower to all the other borrowers so that they can absorb this. So that's why we don't need to print like a secondary token, because we have the borrowers who would like basically step in and help the system. If the system is really under-collateralized, like below a total collateralization ratio, like the collateral value divided by the total debt is below 150%, in that case we also have a recovery mode. Which brings me to the last difference, recovery mode against emergency shutdown. So in our case, the recovery mode means that we relax the conditions under which the troves, the borrowers, can be liquidated. So normally a borrower can only be liquidated if his collateral ratio drops below 110%, which is the individual minimum ratio you need to maintain. But now if the system as a whole has a total collateralization ratio below 150%, it would switch to this recovery mode. And this means that now every borrower whose own individual collateral ratio is lower than the total collateralization ratio of the system, now every such borrower can be liquidated. So if the total collateralization ratio is at 145%, every borrower whose own collateralization ratio is below that threshold can be liquidated. This, of course, is a very harsh measure to the borrowers, but it's the last way of saving the system if there is an extreme scenario where the whole system lacks collateral. But we don't expect that this would happen. Hopefully it would never happen, because there are very strong incentives even before the system would reach this mode that guide away the system from ever reaching it. So we can call it like a self-deterrent mechanism which basically saves the system from ever reaching recovery mode. So difference number one is the fact that our system is algorithmically governed, while Maker DAO's system is subject to human governance. Difference two is single collateral versus multi-collateral. Difference three is decentralized frontend versus one central platform or loan interface. Difference four is LUSD is a fully redeemable token against Ether, while the DAI token in Maker DAO cannot be redeemed in normal times for any collateral. Difference five is the fact that our loans are interest-free. You may pay a one-off fee, but no interest, while on Maker DAO you would pay a recurrent stability fee or interest rate. Another difference is that our collateralization ratio, the minimum ratio, is only 110% that you need to maintain as a borrower, while on Maker DAO it depends on the collateral, but for Ether it's either 130% or 150% based on how much the interest rate is. Difference seven is the fact that we do liquidations differently. We do them instantaneously, while on Maker DAO there is an auction mechanism which normally takes 6 hours, so it's a lengthy process. Difference eight is the fact that while Maker has a facility called a DAI savings rate, which is like a savings account, we don't have this on Liquity, but we do have the stability pool which allows people to gain from staking basically their LUSD tokens to the pool. And there is a second mechanism which is staking their LQTY tokens to get the fee revenue. So those are two systems which are not the same but somewhat equivalent to the DAI savings rate. Difference number eight is the fact that we are not using our LQTY, the secondary token, as a lender of last resort, whereas Maker DAO uses MKR, like the Maker token, to save the system from catastrophes. And last but not least, difference number 10 is we have a recovery mode that basically saves the system if there is an extremely low collateralization, while Maker DAO has an emergency shutdown, which means that in such a case, they would wind down their whole system, while the recovery mode is designed basically to push the system back to normal mode. And that concludes the walkthrough through the 10 key differences between Maker DAO and Liquity. Thank you for your attention.